Welcome back to AP US History, everybody. We laid a lot of groundwork yesterday in our review of Period 2, and I'm really excited to deepen our understanding of the period by expanding and getting our third core concept of Period 2. Let's launch in. As a reminder, here are the things you need to have ready for today's lesson. Please pause the video and gather these materials, then resume when you're ready. Here's a quick overview of our agenda. Let's get to it. Yesterday, we talked about the factors that caused the development of unique colonial identities in different regions of the English colonies. Factors such as geography and motivation for settlement shaped the economic and social institutions of these colonies. So even though they were all settled by English migrants, they were quite different from each other. Today, we are going to zoom into one of the major institutions of English colonies that differed among the regions, and that's labor systems. The development of labor systems in the colonial era dramatically shaped the future of these colonies as they transformed into states. For instance, the dependence on labor in the South led to the creation of a Southern culture rooted in racist systems of oppression, which we still feel the effects of today. Our inquiry for the day is this: why did racial slavery dominate or rise as the dominant labor system in colonial America? When we say racial slavery, we mean slavery that is based on race. Let's begin with a review of some of the most important terms related to our central inquiry. On the first page of your Google Doc handout, you will see a chart with a list of terms. They're also on the screen here. You're going to define each of these terms in as much detail as you can. If you get stuck, ask yourself the following questions. What was this? Who was involved? And why is it significant? AKA, why does this term matter? Pause the video and take 3 minutes to define these terms in as much detail as you can. Go. Okay, let's see what we came up with. We're going to review each term, and as we do, make sure that you're adding to your notes anything that you're missing. Indentured servitude. This was the system that, in exchange for free passage to the colonies, a person agreed to work without pay for 4 to 7 years as a servant. At the end of their term, they were guaranteed a plot of land, which made this very appealing to poor Europeans. Cash crops. These are crops like tobacco, sugar, cotton that were grown in large quantities and then sold for profit. These crops required intensive labor to grow in large quantities. Transatlantic trade. This is a trade system in the 1600s between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. It brought slave labor into the English colonies. And finally, Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon led a rebellion of servants and enslaved people against the planter elite in Virginia. The rebellion was unsuccessful, but in order to prevent future rebellions, planters created a codified racial slavery system to create division between white servants and black enslaved people. Okay, these are some really important terms to understand as we talk about the rise of slave labor in America. If you were able to define 3 of these terms without looking at your notes, you are in really good shape. If you could define 2, you're in okay shape with a little bit of room to improve. But if you couldn't define at least 2 of these terms, you really need to spend some time digging into Period 2. Try searching up some review videos on Khan Academy or using your AMSCO book to review. Before we launch into our doc analysis today, let's review the core concept around the development of labor systems in America. Scroll to the second page of your Google Doc handout, and you will find a chart to take notes. As we review, make sure to add your notes to the chart. Remember, our central inquiry is, why did racial slavery rise as the dominant labor system in colonial America? Well, here's our third concept of Period 2. In early colonial America, indentured servitude was the dominant labor system. However, several factors led to slave labor effectively replacing indentured servitude in the late 1600s, forever changing the fundamental labor system of America. All colonies participated to some degree in developing the slave labor system. Okay, we're going to break this core concept down into two parts. Let's start first with what's underlined on the screen: slave labor replacing indentured servitude. You'll see a chart in your handout labeled Development of Labor Systems in English Colonies. Make sure to take notes in the chart as we review. Here's a picture of labor in America before the 1670s. Indentured servitude was the dominant system. Under this system, as we already discussed, servants served about 4 to 7 years in exchange for receiving a plot of land after their servitude was up. However, while this sounds appealing, most servants didn't actually survive till the end of their servitude. Most of them died due to the harsh conditions that they labored under. But even if they did survive to the end of their servitude, a lot of times there wasn't a ton of land available, especially as we got into the 1650s and 60s. So they began encroaching on Native American territory, which led to conflicts with Native Americans. The turning point comes with Bacon's Rebellion, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in the lesson. So after the 1670s, here's what labor systems look like. Slave labor dominates after the 1670s for a few reasons. Reason number one, there's an increase in wages in England, which makes immigrating to the colonies seem less and less attractive to people. So less people want to come to the colonies. The planter elite, these are the rich people in the South, fear the demands for land that are being made by indentured servitude. So they don't want to give up any more land, and they're afraid of how radical these indentured servitudes are becoming in demanding their land. And finally, the planter elite have a desire for cheap and permanent labor. So even though slaves or enslaved people cost more money up front, the fact that they were permanent slaves meant that over time, they were a cheaper labor force. Pause the video. Make sure you have all these key notes reflected in your chart. Okay. Let's take a minute to synthesize. You just got a lot of information. I challenge you to synthesize what you just learned into one clear sentence. How and why did labor systems change over time in colonial America? Pause the video, take 2 minutes to write one clear sentence. Go. Okay, let's see how you did. Here's my sentence. Large plantation owners drove the switch from servitude to slavery for 3 reasons: labor shortage, desire for permanent labor, and a fear of the white lower class revolt. Pause the video, make sure these key components are reflected in your own synthesis sentence. Awesome. So if that's the first half of our core concept, let's dive into the second half. All colonies participated in this system of slave labor. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wasn't slave labor just big in the South? Well, it's a little more complex than that. And so we see all these colonies either facilitating or profiting from the slave labor system. Let's take a closer look. Still on page 2 of your Google Doc, you'll see a second chart labeled All Colonies Participate in Development of Slave Labor. Make sure you're taking notes in that chart as we go. First, New England. New England facilitated the slave trade through the transatlantic trade system. Remember how we talked about Massachusetts and New England having those great harbors for shipping? Well, turns out the goods that they were shipping were enslaved people. And then, of course, we know that slave labor dominated the South. Let's get a clear picture of how slavery became an institution in the South. Slave labor first was used for the cultivation of cash crops, especially rice and sugar. These crops were labor intensive, and so to grow them and sell them at a profit, a person needed a lot of labor. In order to codify the slavery system, the Virginia government enacted slave laws to ensure slavery was a permanent status of enslaved Africans. So they created laws like children inherited their mother's status. So if a child was born to an enslaved mother, then that child would become an enslaved person as well. They banned interracial marriage so that an enslaved person could not gain free status by marrying a free person. And they made slavery based on skin tone, which is where we start to see race come into this. Okay, pause the video. Make sure you have these notes reflected in your chart. Awesome. So once again, I want to challenge you to really synthesize what we just talked about into one crisp sentence. How did both New England and Virginia play a role in the development of slave labor? Pause the video, take 2 minutes, write one sentence to answer that prompt. Go. Okay, let me show you what I came up with. While slave labor dominated in the South, New England colonies also played a role because they facilitated the slave trade. So slavery would have looked a lot different had New England not been a part of it. That's important to keep in mind as we think about the development of slavery in colonial America. Even if certain regions didn't have slave labor, doesn't mean they didn't benefit or participate in the process. Okay. You are ready to launch into your independent work. There are two facets of independent work today. Now that we've talked about the clear development of slave labor across the colonies, we're going to dig into a single source to add another element of complexity: race. Why did slavery become racialized? In other words, why were Africans relegated to slave status while white indentured servants saw an increase in their social and political status? To answer these questions, we're going to dig into a secondary source by historian Robin Kelly. Scroll to page 3 of your Google Doc and you will find that article. You're going to read the source and annotate in at least 3 places in the text that would help you respond to this question. Why did race-based slavery develop in the English colonies in the late 1600s? Once you've annotated 3 times, you can move to the exit ticket. Your exit ticket is an LEQ body paragraph to develop an argument in response to our central inquiry question. When you answer the LEQ, make sure you draw on both evidence from the article we read, as well as outside evidence from our lecture today. The LEQ question is, why did racial slavery rise as a dominant labor system in colonial America? Okay, you are ready for your independent work. The expectations for this time are the same. They're on the right side of your chart in red. Good luck. I'm super excited to see what y'all have to say about this really complex question. And then I'll see you tomorrow for our closeout of period 2.